Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be terrified before them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Deuteronomy 31:6. The story of Hezekiah and his enemies is one of the great stories in the Bible that shows how God intervenes in the lives of his people. Hezekiah faced numerous challenges, but he trusted God to overcome them. One of the greatest trials was when an army of 185,000 soldiers tried to defeat Judah, but they were unable to do so. This illustrates how divine protection overcame human strength, demonstrating God's power and intervention in the lives of his people. The story of King Hezekiah is a powerful example of divine intervention in the lives of his people. Hezekiah stood out as a righteous and faithful leader, unlike his father King Ahab. From the beginning of his reign, at the age of 25, he sought to do what was right in the eyes of God, following the example of his forefather David. Hezekiah took bold steps to eliminate idolatry in Judah. He tore down the high places of worship, destroyed the sidewalk posts, and removed the bronze serpent Moses had created centuries earlier as a symbol of deliverance. Despite being a divine instrument to liberate the people, the bronze serpent became an object of worship, and Hezekiah decided to end this practice. His commitment to God led him to be considered an exceptional king among all the kings of Judah. Hezekiah trusted fully in the Lord and maintained his faithfulness to the commandments given to Moses. His reign was blessed and prospered by God, and he stood out as a beacon of righteousness in the midst of a history marked by the unfaithfulness and corruption of other kings. Hezekiah's story continues with his challenges against the king of Assyria, Sennacherib. Despite his efforts to make peace, offering large amounts of silver and gold as ransom, Sennacherib did not stop and conquered all the fortified cities of Judah, leaving only Jerusalem. This was a severe blow to Hezekiah, who may have questioned his earlier decisions. When Sennacherib demanded even more wealth, Hezekiah surrendered everything he could find, even dismantling the golden gates of the temple of the Lord. Despite his sacrifices, Sennacherib did not stop and sent a powerful army to attack Jerusalem. In the midst of this crisis, Hezekiah again sought a peaceful solution and admitted his mistake to the king of Assyria at Lachish. However, Sennacherib increased his demands, demanding even more silver and gold as tribute. Hezekiah, desperate to save his people, surrendered everything he could find, even dismantling the golden doors of the temple of the Lord. Finally, Sennacherib sent his generals with a powerful army to besiege Jerusalem. This situation represented a test of faith for Hezekiah and his trust in God. Sennacherib's royal spokesman Rapsis arrived in Jerusalem and stopped by the aqueduct of the upper pool, near the path of the laver's field. They called to King Hezekiah and went out to meet them Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah, who were in charge of the palace. Rapsis began his speech defiantly, asking whom Hezekiah trusted to rebel against the king of Assyria. He ridiculed the idea that Judah could trust Egypt as an ally, comparing it to a reed staff that would break if someone leaned on it. Then Rapsis discredited Judah's trust in the Lord God, recalling the altars and high places that Hezekiah had removed. He offered a deal to the king of Judah, promising 2,000 horses if they could ride riders on them. He insisted that relying on Egypt for chariots and horsemen was the wrong decision. Rapsis claimed that the Lord had commanded him to go up against the land of Judah and destroy it. Sennacherib's royal spokesman laid out what he considered to be the facts, trying to persuade Hezekiah and his people to surrender. He argued that Egypt would not release them, that the demolition of the places of worship would enrage the God of Judah, and that Judah's army was too weak to resist Assyria. Moreover, he falsely claimed that the Lord was on his side. Judah's officials, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah, requested Rapsis to speak in Aramaic, so that the common citizens would not understand his words. However, Rapsis refused and warned them of the miserable fate that awaited them if they did not surrender. Then Rapsis stood up and cried out loudly in Hebrew, conveying the message of the king of Assyria. He warned the people of Jerusalem not to be deceived by Hezekiah, for he would not be able to deliver them from the hand of the king of Assyria. He urged the people not to trust Hezekiah's promises of the Lord's intervention to save them. The three men's request that the negotiations be conducted in Aramaic was intended to protect the listeners on the wall from threats. However, Rapsis did not care for this and wanted everyone to fear the ultimatum of their king. He even threatened the people in Hebrew in the most repulsive manner imaginable. Then, Rapsis warned the people not to believe Hezekiah's promises and offered them peace and prosperity in exchange for their surrender. He promised that each of them would enjoy the fruits of their own land until they were brought to a land similar to his own. He presented a tantalizing picture of a land of grain, new wine, olive groves, and honey. The Assyrian spokesman also challenged the gods of other nations, asking if any of them had delivered their land from the hand of the king of Assyria. This rhetoric was meant to undermine the people's confidence in their God and their king. Despite these provocations, the people of Jerusalem remained silent, complying with the king's order not to respond. Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace, Shebna and Joah, made no response to Rapsis's defiant speech following the king's order. The situation became increasingly tense as negotiations continued, and the fate of Jerusalem hung in the balance. When Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah, King Hezekiah's messengers, returned to him after the disturbing encounter with Rapsis, they found him deeply affected. His clothes were torn, an expression of his inner anguish. Upon hearing the report of Rapsis's insults, Hezekiah reacted in the same way, tearing his clothes and covering himself with sackcloth as a sign of mourning and penitence. He then sought refuge in the house of the Lord, seeking comfort and guidance in the divine presence. With a heart burdened with worry, Hezekiah sent Eliakim, Shebna, and the priestly leaders, all dressed in sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos. Before him, Hezekiah expressed his deep sorrow and supplication to the Lord. He acknowledged the affront the Assyrian king had done to the living God, and asked Isaiah to intercede for the remnant of the people still remaining in Jerusalem. The king's reaction and his search for spiritual direction are a testimony to his deep faith and trust in the Lord. Despite the adversity, Hezekiah did not despair or give up. In his distress, he turned to the only place where he could find comfort and hope, the temple of the Lord. This moment of anguish and despair reminds us that even those who are faithful to God can face difficult times. Faithfulness is not a guarantee against suffering, but it prepares us to face it with courage and trust in God. In times of crisis, we must remember that God is with us and that we can turn to Him for comfort and guidance. Isaiah, God's prophet, responded to King Hezekiah's delegation with words of encouragement and hope. He assured them that they need not fear the words of Assyrian insults, for the Lord would answer those blasphemies. God would send a spirit upon King Sennacherib, and he would return to his land, where he would be defeated by the sword. Isaiah's response not only reassured Hezekiah and his people, but also revealed God's power and sovereignty over human affairs. Despite the imminent threat, God had a plan to protect his people and punish those who rose up against him. When Hezekiah learned that the king of Assyria had left Lachish, he was fighting in Libnah. In addition, he received news that the king of Cush had risen against him. Faced with this situation, Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, sent messengers again to Hezekiah, warning him not to trust his God lest Jerusalem fall into the hands of the Assyrian king. He argued that the gods of the nations defeated by Assyria could not save their people, so why should Judah trust in their God? Sennacherib, from his position in front of the walls of Jerusalem, awaited an answer from Hezekiah. Although the Assyrian king had momentarily withdrawn his army from Lachish to face a new threat, he promised that he would return to fulfill his threats. Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers, and instead of tearing his clothes in despair, he decided to take it to the temple and place it before the Lord. There, Hezekiah prayed fervently to the God of Israel, acknowledging his sovereignty over all the kingdoms of the earth. He lifted up his supplication to the God enthroned above the cherubim, the one true God. Hezekiah recalled the works of destruction carried out by the Assyrian kings in other nations, and the futility of the gods of those peoples, mere human creations without any power. In humility and trust, Hezekiah asked God to save his people from the hand of Sennacherib, so that the whole land would recognize that the Lord alone is God. He recognized that divine intervention would not only bring deliverance for Judah, but would also glorify the true God before all nations. Hezekiah trusted that God would answer his pleas and defend his people, proving once again that the Lord alone is worthy of trust and worship. Isaiah, son of Amos, sent a comforting message to Hezekiah, informing him that God had heard his prayer concerning Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. The Lord's response through Isaiah was a powerful declaration of divine sovereignty over the nations. Sennacherib had been challenged by God himself, who described the contempt and mockery that the daughter of Zion, that is Jerusalem, felt toward him. The Assyrian king had blasphemed against the Holy One of Israel, boasting of his conquests and defying the true God. God, through Isaiah, made it clear that all that Sennacherib had done was within the divine plan. The Assyrian king's victories were predestined by God as part of his eternal plan. Sennacherib was simply a pawn in God's kingdom, and everything he did was subject to divine knowledge and will. Although Sennacherib had taken pride in his conquests, God had total control over his destiny. God's message included a specific sign to Hezekiah. For the next 2 years, the people of Jerusalem would eat of the crops that grew on their own. Although they were besieged by the Assyrians and could not leave the walls to plant, God promised that he would provide food for them. Moreover, in the 3rd year, they would be able to sow, reap, plant vineyards, and enjoy their fruits. This sign provided comfort and hope to Hezekiah and the people of Judah amid the threat of siege and famine. It demonstrated God's faithfulness to his people, even in the darkest of times. God promised that despite the present challenges, the remnant of the house of Judah would take root and bear fruit, and that a band of survivors would emerge from Jerusalem. Divine intervention was guaranteed by the zeal of the Lord of hosts. A remnant would survive, bear fruit, and emerge from the walls of Jerusalem. This promise was based on the Lord's zeal for his glory and for his covenant people. God declared that the king of Assyria would not succeed in his attempt to conquer the city. He would not enter Jerusalem, shoot an arrow, or build a siege mound against it. God himself would defend the city to save it, for his own honor and for the sake of the covenant he had with his servant David. This declaration revealed God's sovereignty over the nations and his faithfulness to his promises. God would not allow the Assyrian king to thwart his plans. Furthermore, he would fulfill his promise to David to keep one of his descendants on the throne of Jerusalem forever. This promise would finally be fulfilled in the reign of Jesus Christ. Divine intervention came that very night. The angel of the Lord went out and killed 185,000 soldiers in the Assyrian camp. The next morning, when the men arose, they found all those soldiers dead. Sennacherib, defeated and fearful, returned home and took refuge in Nineveh. However, his fate was tragic. While worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his own sons murdered him with the sword. The Assyrian king, who had defied the God of Israel, met his doom at the hands of those he trusted. This account shows divine justice and God's protection of his faithful people. Although Jerusalem faced an overwhelming threat, God intervened in a mighty way to save it and fulfill his promises. The story of Sennacherib's defeat is a reminder that God is sovereign over all things and that his faithfulness endures forever. If you have not already done so, we invite you to share God's message to all those who need it, subscribe, and activate the campaign so you will not miss the next message that God has for you. May the peace of our Lord be with you always.